So I'd like to welcome everybody to session 3 of Writing That Scary Thing, How to Write Your Own Obituary. And let me change my view here. Okay. So this is what we did in session 2. We shared our newspaper obituaries and we began looking at online obituaries and seeing the difference between them. Some of you gave me some good online obituaries to look at, so we looked at our favorite. We talked about the difference between telling and showing, and we discussed the rougher than a rough draft, and we discussed anecdotal stories and snippets. So this is right in the middle of my screen. I don't know if I can get it to go down or not. Okay, we'll just go on. So your assignments for today were to write 2 anecdotal stories or snippets and then write your rougher than a rough draft and get that done for us. So we're going to start out by talking about the friends and family interviews. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And does anybody have any comments about the friends and family interviews? Did anybody find out anything interesting? Did you get them back? Okay, you're all shaking your head. You got them back. Some of you are smiling. So tell me, what are you smiling about, Mark Lowry?
Most of the comments I got back confirmed made me feel good because that's things that I really felt I wanted to be. There were a few reminders of some stories and stuff from the past that I've included in one of my anecdotal things. And then, of course, I told them, and I said it's for an obituary, so you don't want to be saying bad things about me. But for the most part, it's interesting that friends from multiple different places, classmates versus friends from my teaching career versus my family, on a lot of the sections had basically the same comments about me.
Okay, so you're
So
a very
I like,
consistent guy, and you came across that way to your friends and acquaintances. Would anybody else like to share what their experience was like with the friends and family interviews?
My in-laws like me better than my own family, I guess.
I know my mother liked her in-laws better than her own family too. So it's
Les, that's probably a crown, a jewel in your crown. Not too many in like their children's spouses.
yeah. Anybody get any interesting stories back from children?
I'm waiting for those. I've got a few outstanding that are due in, and so I don't have a lot to share, but I'm waiting for a couple of those.
Okay.
I would share that my son, we have one son and then 3 daughters. When we're together, my son and I do things together or go to like movies or whatnot, but we don't say a lot to each other. We just seem to know things, I guess, about each other. So when he responded to Desley's, he was supposed to respond to both of us. He chose not to respond to mine. And I think he just couldn't bring himself to it. That emotional, I think, was it. That's kind of made me reflect over the last week or so since he did that, of just how tough it's going to be for him and I to separate. So, I mean, that doesn't add to the story that we're doing here, but it really kind of touched me that he is choosing at this point not to lose me, I guess.
Well, my mom and dad for their 65th wedding anniversary, we had kind of a family reunion, and we had set this up in advance. We had one night where we celebrated their anniversary, and everybody came with stories about mom and dad. And we shared stories about mom and dad with mom and dad there listening to those stories. Oh, we probably shared stories. There's a lot of us, so we probably shared stories for about 2 hours. And they absolutely loved that. And so that's a gift that you can give if you have we probably don't have parents anymore. Most of our parents are gone, but that's a gift that you could give to a spouse, you know, if have got a terminal illness. That's a gift that you might be able to give to them. So
May
think
I
about
tell
that.
a story about my dad?
Certainly, please.
So his birthday and Father's Day and his anniversary is all within a couple of weeks. So I was running short on ideas. So we did a memory list in a short letter. And I reminded him how Bob and I were moving to Germany. The move was coming really quick. Bob was already there. And we needed a new bed to ship. And so he drove home from work from the city. He got back in the car and drove me towards the store, And the salespeople couldn't understand why he wouldn't lay down on the mattress with me. And I said, that's my dad. That's not my husband. So we got over that, but Dad didn't remember that. But I remember that he drove home from work and he drove back in town to help me with that one last, task.
So I'll tell you a real quick funny story about my dad. He came and helped, my mom and dad came and helped us move when we moved to Indianapolis. Our son was about 4 years old, and Gene was a military policeman, and he had some handcuffs, and they decided that they put the handcuffs on Grandpa, and so they did, and they locked him in. And then little Gene comes down and says to me, "Do you know where the key to the handcuffs are?" And we've still got boxes and boxes of stuff. And I said, "No." We ended up having to take my dad down to the sheriff's office and get them taken off. Okay. Anybody else have anything that they'd like to share about their friends and family questionnaires, their interviews with friends and family? Okay, so the purpose of that is it is going to be your family that is going to be reading your obituary, that's going to be remembering you. And so it's really important to honor their memories of you. And then your friends, I think that kind of informs your obituary. It kind of reinforces, like Mark said, that it reinforced the characteristics that he thought he had and that he thought he had shown throughout his life, and that just kind of reinforced that for him. So that part informs it. But we should, if we can, capture some of what our family members, our spouse and our children, our grandchildren. If you don't have children, maybe you've got nieces and nephews that you're very, very close to. And in that case, you would want to honor their memories of you also. Okay, I'm going to go back and share again and we'll get going. Okay, so next what I'd like to do is, and I'd like everybody to participate in this if you could. I guess you could say pass. but we want to share an anecdotal story or a snippet. Now, an anecdotal story is probably about a paragraph long, and a snippet is just probably a sentence or two. So if you've got 2 snippets to share, share that. If you've just got an anecdotal story to tell that you're going to be using in your obituary, share that. So I've probably shared some of these anecdotal stories with you. I've got 2 classes going, so I lose track of what I've done with each one of them. But I have anecdotal stories about cooking. I shared that with you last week about spilled milk. And then I added some more. I talked about parenting. We had 3 children. I loved raising my children, but found the teenage years particularly challenging. My goals and visions for them were reduced one by one into a single goal of keeping them alive until adulthood. I was successful at the last, and I'm happy to say that despite our parenting and the multitudes of advice and wisdom which they happily ignored, they've gone on to become wonderful adults with rich and full lives. So that's an anecdotal story that I added. I added our how we met story. Gina and I met at Fort McClellan after he decided that the women's officers' day room was a great place to hang out. Our first date was to the original Star Wars movie. We enjoyed taking our children to later Star Wars movies and reminding them about our first date. And then I talk about my dissertation. Aside from my family, my best contribution was my doctoral dissertation, The Last Wax, about the women in the last Women's Army Corps Direct Commissioning class, who were immediately moved into the previously all-male Army upon graduation. The story is an untold story about women trying to find a pathway to success. If you Google it, just read the appendices, which tell each woman's story. A lifelong learner. I had decided, they told me after I got my doctorate that that was a terminal degree and that I needed, basically don't come back and take any more classes from us. And I love taking classes. So when Gina and I moved up here by Iowa State, I thought, oh, this is going to be great. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, find a really large lecture class, and I'm just going to sneak in the back of the lecture class, and just, take it all in. And so that's what I had planned to do. And then I got to Iowa, got up here, and I found out about the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for those over 50. And I thought, oh my God, I don't have to sneak. So the Army gave me so many opportunities. At 29, I was responsible for 250 people. I was the first woman in the Army to command an all-male basic training company. I traveled throughout the US, Europe, Korea, Panama, and even Africa. I was a member of a profession, but being an Army officer, a wife, and a mother was not easy, so I juggled. Each day I would decide which area of my life I would be successful at that day. Would I be a good officer, or a good parent, or a good wife? And I apologized to my husband and children if the days did not always work out as they would have liked. And I think that's true of any woman in any profession, that it's just a constant juggling act. And so it seemed especially true to me in the Army, but I think it works out that most women have that. So now I've got my snippets and I've got anecdotal stories. And so I'm taking my mind map over on the left. I'm taking the mind map. These are the things that I said on my mind map that I wanted to include in my Army career, the last wax. And I did. I wrote the story about the Army, and I wrote the story about the last wax. I wanted to include something about music. I don't have anything in here about music. I also wanted to talk about being my own person. I don't have anything in there about that. Loves to laugh. I don't have anything in there about that. I talk about being a parent. I talk about being a lifelong learner, the history, and the cooking. So I've got little anecdotal stories for most of those things, but I'm missing some anecdotal stories. And then you also need to go back through and decide, do I really want to include that? Is it really that important for me to include anything about that in my obituary. And so you can cut things out that you thought were going to be important, but now looking at it, they're just no longer that important to you. Okay, so this is my rough draft. And we may have gone through this last week, but the only thing I'm trying to do is show you how I slide these things in. So, and I need to redo mine. I'm not really happy. I was born in Twin Falls. That came from my newspaper obituary. And after teaching for 2 years, we were both second lieutenants and met. That came from my newspaper obituary also. And we met at Fort McClellan. We enjoyed taking our children to later Star Wars movies. So that's that marriage anecdote that I'm going to slide in right there. So I've got that. And then I'm going to do my Army anecdote and my spilled milk anecdote. And then I took a couple of graduate classes in the middle 90s, and like an addict, I was hooked. I just continued taking classes until I had my doctorate. So that's from my lifelong learning anecdote. And then I talk about my last wax here. And then I go back to the newspaper obituary. And then after retiring from the military, I go on and talk about I worked for 7 years and where I worked and what I did. And I ended up working for 7 years in teacher licensure. And then I go into my lifelong learning anecdote, and then I go back to my newspaper obit, and then I stick the cooking anecdote in, and then I end up with I'm preceded in death and I'm survived by. And we had in my other class, we had some really interesting online obituaries where they didn't say survived by. Left to cherish my memory was one of the things that they said. There were several different phrases that were used that were really a little bit nicer than preceded in death and survived by. So, and then I ended up with something that I took from my sister's eulogy that I did for her because I liked that. And so that's how I put mine together. So what did I leave out? Well, I left out music. I left out really being my own person and loves to laugh. Probably the only thing that's really important for me to put in is music and loves to laugh. You know, something needs to be in there about that. So as you're finalizing your obituary, you need to look back over the tools that we've used, and you need to figure out if your obituary really does what you want it to do. So we started out, and the first thing that we did was we did a tombstone exercise. And I know that most of you stated that what you wanted to be remembered for was for the relationships that you had with your family and the relationship that you have with your God. I know that that's what most of you said. Some of you said something different. If you can't remember exactly what you said, it's on tape in the recording of session 1, and so you can go back and listen to it. But that's what you said your purpose was, and that's, you want your obituary to reflect that. It needs to reflect that. We did that exercise for a reason. And so you want as you're going through and rewriting and finalizing your obituary, you want to make sure that it does what you want it to do, that it reflects your values and how you wanted to be remembered. The next thing that we did was we did the Friends and Family Questionnaire. So you want to make sure that your obituary honors the memories that your friends and family had of you. That's really important. And so one of the things that I really liked about Mark's obituary was that he talked about baiting the hooks for his daughters and then for his granddaughters. And so he's honoring one of their memories that they have of him. And this is his way of saying, yes, that was important to me also. That's an important memory that I have that I share with you. So, as you went through your questionnaires, are there themes? And I think most of you found out that there were some themes that went through it, that it reinforced that the person that you were trying to be, that's exactly how you came across to your friends and family. And so if you can weave those things into your obituary, then what you're doing is you're honoring what your friends and family thought of you, and that's important. So that's a check that you need to do, is to make sure that your obituary is doing that. You need to figure out, in public affairs, they say, who is your audience? I mean, who is this obituary really written for? Is this obituary a last hurrah for you, where it says all these accolades about you? Or is your obituary for your grandchildren to be able to read and find out about their grandfather or their grandmother? If you don't have children, maybe it's a niece or nephew that's going to read this and find out, oh, and they did that also. I didn't know about that. That's really cool. And oh, look, I was important. I was mentioned in this obituary. So you need to figure out who is your audience? Who's really going to read your obituary? Yes, there are going to be strangers that read your obituary, and it's nice for them to get a glimpse of who you are. But the obituary is really a way for the family to kind of cement some of their memories of you and put it out there. So your obituary is for your spouse or partner, your children or grandchildren. It's for your siblings, if you have living siblings, your nieces and nephews, your friends, and probably lastly for your colleagues. And of course, there will be strangers that read it. But you want your obituary to be for those people. So I know a lot of you want to go back and include a lot of the jobs that you had when you were in the military. And maybe that's important. But maybe it's more important, to say some of the things that you did in the military, not necessarily the jobs that you had, but some of the things that you did and some of the impacts that you made. And maybe you didn't make large impacts in the military, but maybe you were a really good mentor. Maybe you mentored people. What were some of the strengths that you have? Because your children and your grandchildren won't understand this laundry list of jobs that you held. That will not have a lot of meaning to them. What will mean a lot to them is that you served, and you served for 30 years, you continued serving, and the final job that you had was this, and one of the major accomplishments that you did in that job was this. But if you do a laundry list of 5 or 6 jobs that you had, it's not going to resonate with your children, your grandchildren, your nephews and nieces. It might resonate with your colleagues, and it might resonate with somebody who's been in the military for a long period of time, but it's not going to resonate with the audience that you really want this obituary for. This is something that people, if it's a family member, people keep obituaries. When I went through my grandparents' things and when I went through my parents' things, they had obituaries of family members that they had kept. And that's what you want. You want this to be something that could be kept by a family member. There's not that need to keep that physical copy anymore, because you can always go online and see it. But at the time, that was what they did. They cut the obituary out and they kept that. So I'm going to end with this, and Jenny sent this to me, and if I had read this before, I had forgotten it, and I had certainly hadn't recognized the significance of this. We're only going to look at the first three stanzas of this. We'll look at some more of the stanzas next time we get together. It's called The Dash by Linda Ellis, written in 2015. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between the years. For that dash represents all the time that they spent alive on earth, and now only those who loved them know what that little line was worth. And so that's who we're writing our obituaries for. We're writing our obituaries for the people who loved us, cherished us, and for our friends, and perhaps for our colleagues and classmates. That's who our obituary is written for. So the next step, I want you to do, well, this is my next step. I need to put in something about loves to laugh and enjoy being a grandmother. I need that in my obituary. And I need to edit it to make sure that that obituary reflects my values. And we discussed our values when we talked about that tombstone exercise, that it honors important memories of families and friends. That's our friends and family questionnaire that we've sent out. And does it let my intended audience know their importance in my life? You know, that's what I want my obituary to do. And then you can add photos to your obituary. So your assignment, yes, you have an assignment, you have homework for next week. So you want to finish your online obituary. And your online obituary should tell your story that comes from your mind map. It should reflect your values that came from the tombstone exercise. It should honor the memories that others had of you that comes from our friends and family questionnaire. And then you should gear that for your intended audience, who you want to read your obituary and who you want to have the obituary mean something to them. So I want you to select 2 or 3 paragraphs out of your finalized obituary to read and share next week. And I would like you to email me a photo, and you can select up to 3. And so you could email me 3 photos that you would like to use in your obituary. So if I were doing it, I would pick one young and one older. So you saw my young one, I was a young lieutenant there, and my older one, that was a pretty recent one. And then I would pick a family photo. But my family hasn't been together all together for many years. We catch a child here and there, but we might catch 2 of them at one time, but we certainly do not catch 3 of them at one time. So that's what we're going to do for the next time we get together. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Les.
Do you, Mary Lou, do you have a list of pros and cons for using first person and third person?
You know, my big con would be that, yeah, we went through some pros and cons on that last week. So a pro would be that it is very, if you use first person, it's very personalized, and it does give you an opportunity to really speak to those people that loved you. A con, the biggest con that I had is it is a very, very difficult thing to do, and it is hard to do without sounding very, I use the word flip. You know, there's, it just, you know, both examples that I read last week, I am deceased, I am no more, how do you start out? How do you start your obituary out when you're doing it in first person? How do you end it when you're doing it in first person? It was easier for me to end mine in first person, but starting it out and carrying it throughout the entire thing, I don't know. I'm not really satisfied with it. I really need to rewrite mine because I don't like the first person, but I gave it a shot. But those would be my big pros and cons about writing it in first person.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, Scott here. Do you still want us to focus on something like 1,000 words, Mary Lou?
Yeah, I would make your obituary, your online obituary somewhere, anywhere from 600 to 1,000 words. Get it in that ballpark. That gives you an opportunity to tell a few more stories. If you go over a little bit, but usually 2 typewritten pages, double spaced, it's
Yeah.
probably about the word as probably about the length that you're looking for, maybe just a tad longer. So you have room to do these things, but there are other ways to tell your story also. And I love the online obituary that I found that had the video from the funeral, not the video of the funeral, but the video that they show, where it has all the pictures and the music behind it, And so that was on the online obituary. That's something I'd like to have on mine, I think, connected to that. I have a DVD of my mother's, but I don't have anything of the one we put together for my dad. It was put together and it's gone. It would be nice if I had that still and I could put that with their online obituary.
Okay, thanks.
Mary Lou?
Yes.
I don't know if it's so much of a question as maybe just a confusion or overlap of words. When I was writing this, I was talking with Desley about it, that what's the difference between the online obituary and your eulogy, which would typically be read, I guess, at the funeral?
Actually, at both my mother and my father's funeral, they actually read the obituary, that I had written. That's what they read. And then other friends and family and got up and said other things, about my mother and father, but they actually did read the obituary. So
The newspaper version rather than the online version?
no, they read the online version. They read the longer version of both my mother and father during their funerals. I don't know whether that's the case everywhere. I'm not really certain. Larry, I think you have a question, but you're muted.
Okay, how's that? A couple of things. Number one, I just want to say that mind map was an incredibly good exercise. That really, really helped writing this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It really did. And I'm like you, I left out 3 things that I have to go back and get in it somehow. But that's a great exercise, a great way to do this. The other thing is, and I've been writing for 50 years, not about my death, but I found when you get into the meat of it, after all the, whose family, who your family is and who you're survived by and all that stuff, the meat of it, I found my paragraphs kept rolling over each other. I was looking for a good organization of those paragraphs, first thing, where I was born, and then the story about the the getting into West Point. Then I have a paragraph on my on sort of my military resume, but it's just one paragraph. It's not dominating anything. Then I have a paragraph about my family, where Diane and I met, and then more about the family and what I loved and what I did and all that stuff. But you know, one of the things from your template, I found the things that are most important to me in the world came towards the bottom of the obit, you know, namely my family and what I love to do and what I remembered and that sort of thing.
And you can change that around, Larry. That template was just so that you would get those things in there that need to be in there. They don't necessarily
I understand that there's no obituary police, but
no.
I just found it interesting that when I sort of finished my first draft, that the things I really like to talk about were at the bottom of it instead of at the top.
I can see that, and I think that's because you're wanting to do it in a linear fashion, you know, and when you do it in a linear fashion, what is most important to us is the things that we recognize now that are most important to us, you know.
Yeah.
The jobs we held, they kind of go away. They kind of slip away. The things that we did, but those relationships, those family relationships, the relationships that you have with friends, you know, the adventures that you went on, those are just those are lovely things. And there should be some way to put them in. I was trying to find an obituary of a general officer, you know, who had really done something, and then see what the obituary was. And so I went back and I read General Schwarzkopf's obituary. I read 3 or 4 different versions of his obituaries in different papers. And it was interesting because they didn't really tell the story in a linear fashion. You know, it started out with what was important and then wove in those other things as it went along. And so I found that very interesting that it was not done, you know, that way. Any other questions or insights? Okay, well, I'm hoping that this has been a good exercise for you, and stick with it for another week, and let's see if we can't get. It's not going to be a finalized product. It's not going to be a finalized product because you'll need to go through that every couple of years and look at it and see if it still represents the values and represents who you are, and shows the differences as you're aging between who you were and who you are now. So you'll update it just like I need to update mine. I think we started out and I said that, you know, Mary Lewis taught a lot of people how to write their own obituaries, but hers is sorely lacking. So I need to get on that. So thank you everybody for coming. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I look forward to hearing some of your obituary, and we'll listen to as much as we can, but we'll keep it to about 3 or 4 paragraphs so that we can get everybody in and listen to everybody. And then we'll talk about next steps. What's next? What's next after you've written this? Thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary
Thanks, Mary
Lou.
Lou. Thanks,
And
everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
I won't